Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Kidney Coach YouTube channel. I am naturopath Fiona Chin, and I'm very honoured today to be joined by the amazing Dr. Ian Lake. He joins us all the way from the United Kingdom. So he sounds a little bit more like me today than some of our other guests, which is fantastic. So Dr. Ian Lake is a general practitioner, and he has been in practice for over 30 years now. And he has an absolute interest in type 1 diabetes because he's had it himself. And I'll let him talk to his story and what he's been through with that. But through that, it's really led him to understand the implications of diet, and especially what we're going to talk about today, the ketogenic diet, and how that affects his insulin levels, and what we can potentially do using a ketogenic diet to really make ourselves healthier and maybe to support the pancreas and things like that. So that's really what we wanted to cover today. He's been amazing at training other healthcare professionals at really understanding how to use and implement ketogenic diets, and training people on the use in type 1 and type 2 diabetes, because there is a huge, I guess, and you can speak to this, Dr. Slate, but a huge lack of knowledge that general practitioners get on just dietary advice. So he does run training for other professionals, and I'll put some notes down below about that at the end. And also, I have to mention, didn't you do a 500-mile run in 2 days with no food or something crazy like that? So he's also put this diet to the test. So
well, that sounds no, it sounds far too ambitious. No, we did a 100-mile run in 5 days with no food at all, just had water and electrolytes.
That's still amazing. So
yeah, that was to prove a few things really about type 1 diabetes more than anything else. There are 2 people with type 1 on the run, and there are 8 in total.
Amazing. Well, I think just that alone is testament that there must be something in this that we need to dive into. So I'm going to hand it over to you, but I think let's a great place to start. And I think most of our viewers understand the link between, or that type 1 diabetes has a huge link to kidney disease. But let's just go over diabetes 1 and 2. What is it? Is it on the rise? What are the numbers like? And why is this such a problem? And why have we not dug into this maybe more than we should have?
Yeah, thank you. Well, broadly, diabetes splits into 2 main categories. That's type 1 and type 2. There are other rarer conditions which are more genetically derived, but broadly type 1 diabetes is what we want to talk about today. And that is where the body fails to produce any insulin at all, or produces very tiny amounts, which aren't enough to sustain life without external replacement, so hormone replacement therapy, if you like. The causes of type 1, there are probably many, and we don't really understand how type 1 it starts. There is a tiny genetic component compared, say, to type 2 diabetes. And type 1 diabetes is characterized by autoantibodies, and there are at least 4 sorts of autoantibody. Curiously, though, 2 types of autoantibody don't seem to relate to the structures themselves. So we've got anti-GAD antibodies, anti-glutamic acid decarboxylase antibodies, and we have anti-zinc transporter antibodies, plus islet cell, which we can sort of understand a little bit. If you've got antibodies against your islet cells, it's a bit troublesome. Yeah. And then, of course, anti-insulin antibodies. And they often appear in sequence, but you can have type 1 diabetes without any antibodies at all. We do know that certain things make you more vulnerable. The distance from the equator seems to be important. However, in the northern latitudes where I come from, Sardinia, which is an island off Italy, has the highest rate of type 1 diabetes in Europe. So it might or might not be a genetic component to that. But typically, as you go further north, the Scandinavian countries, Norway, Finland, Sweden, Iceland, tend to have a higher incidence of type 1 than further south. Also related to that is vitamin D supplementation, vitamin D levels. And supplementation has been shown to reduce the incidence of type 1 in Iceland. Likewise, the casein A1, which is the most common component in most milk, is thought to promote type 1 diabetes, and also gluten. And people with celiac disease and gluten enteropathy, they tend to have a higher incidence of type 1 diabetes. And then, of course, we've got the viruses, and however many viruses there are, goodness knows. But it seems something destroys the pancreas, and it never recovers. Although it does seem to recover in what's called the honeymoon period. So somebody can present with diabetic ketoacidosis and have loads of autoantibodies, and then all of a sudden they'll get better for 2 years, and then they'll have to take insulin after that amount of time. So I don't know quite what the basis for the honeymoon period is, based around the idea that antibodies destroy your pancreas and then it all of a sudden recovers. So the etiology, the cause of type 1 diabetes is poorly understood. But what is absolute is that everyone with type 1 will need to take insulin for the rest of their lives, unless an amazing cure happens anytime soon, which I don't think it will. So type 1 is characterized by the need to take insulin, and type 2, as we know, is mostly caused by too much insulin in the system, and the body becomes resistant to it. And insulin is a fat storage hormone, so the majority of people who are hyperinsulinemic are also obese, and therefore obesity is strongly associated with type 2 diabetes. But for metabolic reasons, that insulin is a fat storage hormone. So if you have too many carbohydrates, you've got too much being converted to fat unless you're exercising. And then, of course, you can get rid of the sugar through your muscles. So that's another good way of burning up blood glucose. So that's the way it's done. So in type 1 diabetes, because we have no insulin, and because insulin is the only hormone to reduce blood glucose levels, and that the origin of blood glucose levels can be internal from something like glucagon or gluconeogenesis, the process of making glucose, but more typically it comes from our diet. So any form of carbohydrate and some protein will break down into glucose, and there's only 1 teaspoon equivalent of glucose in the whole of our blood volume, which is roughly 4 to 5 liters, and that maintains our blood glucose at, do you do millimoles per liter?
Yes, yeah, that's how
millimoles per liter. It's about 5 millimoles per liter. So multiply that by roughly 20, so 90 milligrams per deciliter, roughly, multiply by 18. So our body maintains that. So if you have 2 teaspoons of glucose in your blood volume, you've got a blood sugar of 10. Of course, that's far too high. So the body has to clear the blood from the glucose from the bloodstream. So it does that under the influence of insulin and exercise, which of course requires insulin for the muscles to be more active and more efficient at using glucose. It's very, very difficult, and well, some people can do it. In the UK, based around what we call the National Diabetes Audit, which captures about 95% of all people with type 1 in England and Wales, and Scotland's a different country, and Northern Ireland's different from that purpose, but you can assume that the UK, 95%, only about 6 to 7% of people achieve an HbA1c of 48 millimoles per mole, which is 6.5%. Which is a tiny percentage. 70% of people with type 1 diabetes have an HbA1c at 58 millimoles per mole, which is 7.5% or above. So 70% of type 1s have a HbA1c, which will, according to one study, one poster I found at the European Association for the Study of Diabetes, published in 2020, is estimated that those people lose 100 days of life for every year their HbA1c is above 7.5% or 58. So
wow,
it's a difficult situation to get your head around, isn't it?
Yeah. So just for people listening that don't know what the HbA1c is, do you want to just let them know and why that marker is so important?
Yeah. So basically, if you have too much sugar in the body, the sugar reacts with other tissues and proteins, and it also reacts with the blood cells, the hemoglobin, the A1, one of the subunits of hemoglobin, and the C stands for carbohydrate. So the blood glucose sticks everywhere if it's in excess, but it's easier to measure the blood than, say, a tendon or a bit of neural tissue or something like that. So every 3 months, roughly, although red cell turnover does vary in different people, but roughly every 3 months you get new blood. And you can measure the amount of sugar stuck onto the red blood cells. And because the red blood cells change every 3 months, the percentage of glucose attached to those red blood cells gives you a rough idea, or a reasonably accurate idea, actually, of how well your diabetes has been controlled over the previous 3 months.
Mm-hmm.
And every 3 months you can get the test repeated. So for someone who doesn't have diabetes, it's under 40. The official figure is 42, but it's really under 40, in the high 30s really. For the diabetes threshold is 48 millimoles per mole, which is 6.5%. And above that, you know, your blood glucose will be on average over 11 most of the time. And that will be reflected.
Really how sweet your blood is, really, isn't it?
Sorry?
Almost how sweet your blood is.
It's exactly a marker, yeah. And the HbA1c is a good predictor of complications in the long term, which is why we use it, really.
Okay, so you were saying before, really, 6.1 or 2% are less than 48. So most people with type 1 diabetes will sit at a very high HbA1c, which has then got all these complications such as kidney disease and everything else that happens because their red blood cells are carrying around so much glucose stuck basically to the outside of that red blood cell.
And it causes damage.
Yes.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that. So let's talk about all the things that come, because it's not just having to take insulin for the rest of your life. There are a huge amount of things. I had a good girlfriend die from type 1 diabetes, and in the end she had kidney failure, was in a wheelchair, completely blind, totally wasted away to nothing because she refused to take insulin. So type 1 diabetes, I think people think, oh, it's very well controlled if I just take my jab of insulin, but that's not necessarily the case. So do you want to just run briefly through what happens when that HbA1c gets high and the damage that can cause systemically to other organs?
Yeah, so you can stay alive as long as you inject insulin. So insulin is a crucial hormone, and we all respect it. And if the company's closed down, it's game over. So we want these companies to stay healthy. But the art of controlling your insulin by injecting it into the skin and hoping to catch the spike of blood glucose after your previous meal is what is required of every person with type 1 diabetes. So you're taught to look at some food and estimate how many grams of carbohydrate there are in that food. You're then taught to estimate how much insulin you're going to need to cover that carbohydrate. And that will change in people. So children will need to take less insulin than some crusty old person like me who will need to take more per gram of carbohydrate. And then, of course, women in the time of menstruation, they will probably need to double that amount of insulin, for example, during that particular week or so around the time of periods. So you have not only to estimate your amount of carbs and then inject the right amount of insulin, but you've got to assume that the insulin will be absorbed into your bloodstream at a regular rate, which it doesn't always. And you've got to assume the insulin's good quality, which most of it is, but there are studies to show that it varies. And then you've got to hope that the amount of carbohydrates that you've estimated is absorbed into the stomach at the right rate, and you've got no hold up or something like that. And then you're hoping that as the insulin cuts in and drops your blood glucose, the food comes in and raises the blood glucose up. So you're trying to get a level playing field at the end of the day. And it does make absolute sense. There's a lot of guessing, but it does make a lot of sense, and people can do it to some degree or other. I was never very good at it, and it wasn't because I'm stupid. It was just because it's a very difficult art form. And of course, you go to your annual review and you say, "Oh, my HbA1c is not very good." I mean, the one before I went keto was 86, which is appalling. Really, it's very bad. And you know, I was going through. I defocused on my diabetes. Let's put it that way. And it showed. Luckily, I had no complications, but in concert with that, I just had diabetes for 20 years, and I just started to get retinopathy. And I thought, oh my God, this is the beginning of the end. You know, here we go. We've reached the top of the hill now. So, you know, you can control your diabetes with high carbohydrates, but very few people can do very well at it, such that they can keep their blood sugars normal. Now we have pump technology, we have these hybrid loop systems, we have closed loops. They will make some degree of difference, but they won't make a huge amount of difference according to study figures. You know, it lowers the HbA1c from 70 to 65 in the people that they've tested it, which is not enough to get you where you want to be. But they can be very useful. There's some good indications for pumps. and they are amazing technology. But I don't think for the majority of people who haven't got any problems with pens, pumps are going to get them there where they want to be. So with carbohydrates, you're going to almost certainly have swings of blood glucose up and down throughout the day, and that can be quite disabling. And I decided to go on a ketogenic diet, in a crisis time, and it was so transformative. I haven't shut up about it since, really, because it made such a difference. It was unbelievable, the difference it made within the first injection of estimated insulin for an omelette, 2 units as opposed to 6 to 8 units for a porridge, for example. And the blood sugar just going all day was an absolute revelation. And it stayed like that, really.
So what led you to a ketogenic diet? Was it research, something you'd read? It just makes sense. How did you get to that point that you were like, you know what, I'm starting to get some retinopathy, which for people who don't know, that's and what happens in diabetes is it can attack the tissue of the eye, so people can end up with blindness, really long term, right?
Yeah, long term, yeah. It was Richard Bernstein's diabetes solution, which did it for me. It was an accidental Google. I was looking for something else for diabetes, and that flicked up. And I thought, that's interesting. Read it. And then I put it down because there's too much fat in that. I just can't be doing with that. Because, still believed in the whole idea that low fat, high carbohydrate was the way to go. And of course, subsequently, I felt it wasn't. So it does require a change in your thinking, really. And because there's a personal need to do so. I put the book down for a year, and only a year later did I pick the book up again and think, I better try something because I've got absolutely nothing to lose here. And that sort of thing, So Richard Bernstein is a very good resource. He sort of explains it in great detail, but it's accessible, and he tells a lot of personal stories. And he's had diabetes for years. The key thing about Richard Bernstein is that when he was 49, he had complications of type 1 diabetes, discovered keto, and then most of his complications disappeared. And that's the key thing about him. So it sort of shows that if you normalize your blood glucose, you've got a very good chance of restoring some of your tissue. And I think ketone diets help that too for other reasons.
So let's dive into the world of ketones and keto diets. So for people listening, there is a stigma around keto diets. People think Atkins and then Atkins diet and all these sort of things. So let's actually get into the proper science of what a ketogenic diet is and why is it so good for controlling type 1 diabetes?
Okay, so ketogenic diet means that your body is producing ketone bodies. So you have to burn fat in order to produce ketone bodies. That is just the way the biology works. So you cannot produce ketones if you're not burning fat. So if you're on a high carbohydrate diet and on the standard 3 meals a day plus snacks, you'll be spending at least 2/3 of your time burning sugar and storing what you need to store to keep your blood glucose as normal as you possibly can. So, about 2/3 of the time on a normal diet, which I'd call a normal guideline type of diet of high carbs, you will have no opportunity to burn fat. So people with type 1 diabetes will have 0 ketones for the majority of time. If you miss a meal, or if you have an extra long sleep, or if you decide not to eat carbohydrates, so you eat more fats and proteins, for example, and then your body will have no source of sugar. So it can make the sugar there will be some protein, which will provide some sugar from the diet, but any shortfall of sugar, which is required for critical tissues in the brain, and also the red blood cells are wholly dependent on glucose, that will be made in-house through the liver and other tissues. But the majority of the energy will have to come from fat burning. So your body searches around for some energy and says, oh, we've got plenty of fat hanging about. So it uses the fat in preference to the glucose, and it produces as much glucose as it needs for its daily requirements. So it can produce 200 to 300 grams of glucose a day if it has to. but it will end up burning fat through the mitochondria, which every cell apart from red blood cells have. And as the end result, at the end result of burning fat, you have to produce ketone bodies. So ketone bodies are high energy molecules, and they're also highly soluble. They can whip into the brain very, very quickly indeed, and they can provide muscles and all tissues with sufficient energy, one through burning fat, but the other way through burning ketones themselves. And of course, the funny thing about the idea of ketosis being a starvation diet is, well, it isn't if you're having sufficient calories and you're topping up your calories with fat and protein, because, you know, if you've got excess ketones in your body, you will excrete them. So if you're accidentally burning too much fat, or you suddenly stop exercising or whatever, you will just excrete the ketones either in your breath or in your urine, or probably, you know, through your skin or whatever. So what an amazing mechanism. So if your ketone levels are too high, you just excrete them. Now, in type 1 diabetes, because people are taught to have lots of sugar in their diet, they're rarely in a state of ketosis. So the normal state for the vast majority of people on a conventional diet with type 1 diabetes is 0 or tiny amount of ketones. So when they wake up in the morning, they've probably got, you know, subnutritional ketosis levels of ketone bodies. And of course, if you don't have insulin, insulin regulates the sugar going into the bloodstream. And if you can't get the sugar into the bloodstream because there's no insulin, you have to then force your body to burn fat because it cannot access sugar. And that sends you into something called diabetic ketoacidosis, which of course can be fatal if not picked up, and certainly can end up being in hospital, possibly in a coma. You know, it's a very, very serious condition. So I think naturally people are frightened of keto diets in type 1 because of the connotation or the association of diabetic ketoacidosis in poorly controlled diabetes, or in diabetes where you have a serious infection, which requires a huge amount of insulin in order to keep blood sugar stable. But on a ketone diet, on a nutritional ketosis, it's impossible if you've got sufficient insulin to actually go into anything other than nutritional ketosis, which will feed your body forever. And the other thing to bear in mind is that, well, when we did our 0-5-100, I conceived it to say, well, how can I actually put to bed this worry about diabetic ketoacidosis? This idea that if you're taking insulin, you have to take glucose, because we didn't for 5 days, and we still took insulin. But the thing is, when we were calculating how we're going to do this, we realized that there are only 2,500 calories roughly of glycogen, which is stored glucose in the body at any one time. But there are, you know, somebody like me, body mass index 22, I've got 85,000 calories of fat ready to go, if you see what I mean. So if you're in a steady state and you're not anaerobic, because anaerobic exercise can only burn sugar, you cannot burn fat. If you're anaerobic, it doesn't work. So you need aerobic exercise to burn fat. But if you're steadily just sort of plodding along at a reasonable jogging pace, or cycling, or just pottering about throughout your daily life, you will have more than enough fat, more than enough ketones, and you won't need any sugar to provide your energy. So nutritional ketosis can be very healthy. And the reason it's so good in type 1 diabetes, you don't have to inject much insulin to actually manage your sugar, because your sugar levels are naturally low. The biggest enemy actually is the sugar that your body produces through the liver, through cortisol, adrenaline, glucagon, those mechanisms. And of course, you have to then have a little bit of insulin, and it's typically called background or basal insulin, in order to control that effect. But the dietary control, the rapid acting insulin that you take with meals, you need 1 to 2 units, mostly to cover the effect of the protein, which will break down to glucose in some cases. So it's a very, very good diet. Minimal insulin. So we always, yeah, go on, sorry.
No, I was going to say, walk me through what happened and how your dietary changed. So first off, how did your diet look before, and what does it look now after being keto? And then what did your insulin units go from to now? And then just how you felt in your body differently when you switched from one to the other, and how quickly did you notice the differences? And was it easy to implement? Because that's what people want to know if they're thinking about this.
Okay. So it was a sudden changeover of diet from, day naught onwards. It was a sudden change. There's 30 grams of carbs or fewer from that day. Before that, it was something like porridge or toast or baked potatoes. If you had a sort of what we call a Sunday roast over here, you probably don't have that over.
No, we do. We love a good Sunday roast.
Sort of thing. It would have sort of root vegetables, parsnips, or Yorkshire puddings or whatever, sandwiches for lunch typically. That's sort of standard meal. Not so much in the way of pudding type of foods, but if you did, it would be a fruit salad, which is quite carby, really. I don't tend to do that now. So what you call a standard diet that anyone would have. So beer would be more than allowed, which is something I don't drink much of now. Those sort of things. It's just been a standard lifestyle, snacking a little bit, going a bit hypo, having a snack, biscuits typically, or glucose tablets, which I use now. Keto diet totally changed, because whereas before I was on 3 meals a day, I'm now on a maximum of 2 meals a day, occasionally 1, but mostly 2, for reasons of control. And it starts off, with a lunchtime meal, and that would typically be something like an omelette or something like that, or something with cheese or some green veg or some meats or whatever. And that would continue. So no snacking at all required. Any snacking for glucose control reasons would be pure glucose tablets, which gives you far more control rather than the chocolate or something, which is not brilliant for controlling hypos, although anything you've got in your pocket is better than nothing. So, but glucose tablets and berry fruits. I think there are 8 types of food you can typically have for ketones, aren't there? There's nuts, there's green vegetables, there's berry fruits, there's healthy oils, which are basically olive oil and butter and things like that. There's dairy, there are eggs, there are meat, and there are fish. And that gives you a good variety of food when you get used to it. Some people have a sort of a carb addiction, I would call it, or certainly a need to eat carbohydrates. I think that's quite deep-seated in some people, and they cannot conceive how to live a life without carbs. But over time, if you get good results, so my insulin level was about 40 units, something like that, a day. And now it's down to around 20, depending, 18 to 24 units per day now, typically. And most people end up on that. It's about half. Most people end up around about 20 units, which suggests that's as low as you can go with type 1 diabetes. So amazing. It works very well. It controls the HbA1c amazingly. I haven't, for the last 7 years, had an HbA1c in the diabetic range ever since. And that is incredible if you think about it. And it does other things. It gives you awareness. People are much more aware. Brain fog disappears, joint pains disappear, vision tends to improve a little bit because you haven't got these surges of sugar going through them. So people have this general sense of well-being, and it's pretty easy to do, I would say.
And with people listening and thinking that they've got, I just want to circle back to kidney disease. So people listening would probably know diabetes is the leading cause of kidney disease. And, generally with people with type 1 diabetes, there is some sort of kidney failure that happens long-term, especially the more uncontrolled it is. I think the theory, and you can speak to this, probably you would know better than me, that the sugar molecules that we're speaking to that are attached to the red blood cells go through, and there's almost an abrasive action that they have on kidney tissue. So there's that fibrotic scarring that happens in the kidneys because they're filtering all the sugar out and all of those sort of things. So that's part of that pathway. And you've got diabetic neuropathy. Then people can get gangrene where they, losing limbs and all sorts of things when that blood sugar is uncontrolled. So people with people with kidney disease generally are frightened of things like ketogenic diets, because I think people hear high protein, and of course we know that that's not the case. It's high fat. But good healthy fats that you spoke to, like olive oil and nuts and seeds and oily fish, all the things that we know in like a Mediterranean diet or things like that, that actually lower the risk of things like heart disease and all these other bits and pieces. And then we're eating foods that are kidney protective, such as green leafy vegetables and berry fruits, which we know actually help protect kidney tissue. So do you think, you know, just to talk to the people that think, well, I've got kidney disease and I can't eat, you know, a lot of this protein, like lots of meats and things like that, because I've been told by my doctor not to do that, and there's too much potassium and this and that. Can you speak to that a little bit to ease people's minds about why it would still be very useful in kidney disease?
Yeah, I mean, the keto diet has a broad definition. There are some people, and I sort of go through phases. Some people think that you need more protein. It needs as much protein as you want, the fat follows. And other people think that you should keep the protein at a reasonable level and increase the fat as you decrease the carbs. And that's what I think is probably good if you're worried at all about kidney disease of any form. Renal disease up to stage 3. Do you have EC? Yeah. EGFR. Stage 3 renal disease is probably, you can take as much protein as you want. People sort of 3B, 4, it's starting to get a bit more tricky because your kidneys are leaking protein. So they're retaining your body's protein. So some people would advocate reducing the amount of protein in the diet at that stage. I'm not specialist enough to pass comment on that, but the people I've spoken to, the renal specialists, especially those that deal with polycystic kidney disease, feel that if you keep to around sort of 0.5 to 0.75 grams of protein per kilogram of ideal body weight, that will get you about there. Now, if you're a growing child, you'll need absolutely specialist advice because you will need a lot of protein in order to grow. Protein is the most complete food there is, and it can be converted to everything else in the body. And if you're bodybuilding or want to put on muscle bulk for whatever reason, you'll probably need more protein. But if it's going into something and not getting, you're not wasting too much of it, I think you have to work with what your body's given you, and you need to monitor your EGFR quite frequently to make sure the diet you've chosen is safe for you. But by and large, the keto diet doesn't increase the amount of protein or doesn't have to increase the amount of protein. It has huge benefits because it normalizes blood glucose. It reduces your hypos by, one study showed a factor of 6. The study I did on my website showed that 75% had half or fewer hypos. It reduces the amount of insulin your body needs. And I think that's quite important because with insulin, we get hyperinsulinemia and we get chronic disease and inflammation as a result of hyperinsulinemia. So I think cutting your insulin volumes down is beneficial, and a keto diet does that easily for you, and you can halve your insulin without endangering yourself in any way at all. And I think the lack of inflammation in the renal tissues would help a lot, and normalizing glucose would help enormously. There's this pathway I discovered a year or so ago called the sorbitol pathway, and the renal tissue and the retinal tissue is not able to convert glucose into the right compounds, and they tend to become more toxic in those tissues because there's just that those tissues don't have sorbitol dehydrogenase, which is required, and every other tissue has. So there are two components to kidney, more than two components to diabetes renal disease. There's hyperinsulinemia causing inflammation. There's high glucose, which causes damage to the cells themselves. And then, of course, they're the two main mechanisms, because you've got this hyperinsulinemia causing inflammation, and that will cause the large vessel disease, and the hyperglycemia will cause the small vessel disease, which is the eyes, the kidneys, the nerve endings, etc. So I don't think there's anything to worry about unless you're really, getting into progressive renal disease. Then you need to seek the help of a specialist.
And then we suggest a keto analog. Then we'd use the my brain has gone blank, but the keto analog diet. So that's when we use
absolutely. Yeah, and of course, all of it hinges on whether protein causes renal damage at all. And this is based on evidence from the 1960s, I think, which has just been repeated and repeated and repeated.
Yes,
you're more of an expert than me on that. But therefore, we have to debate, if a body's losing protein because the kidney's damaged, you've got to make up that shortfall. Otherwise, your body's going to become emaciated at some point because you've got to replace the protein somehow. So it's a delicate balance to get it right. And specialists like yourself and the kidney PKD specialists who are using keto diet with great success, I think they should be, they should have a voice really, and this should become part of a specialist renal diabetes management really.
No, I totally agree. What we're Jesse, Anna, and I are seeing, and going back to using ketogenic diets and to control kidney disease has been actually quite amazing. So, and the other thing that you spoke to with your change is obviously more clarity in the mind and things like that. And of course, a lot of people don't realize that for every 1 gram of fat versus say a gram of carbohydrates, you get 4 units of energy versus 1 unit of energy. So fats are actually far more energetically stimulating to mitochondria health and all of those sort of things, which we know mitochondrial decline is such a driver in things like heart disease, kidney disease, lots of our neurological diseases and things like that. So that the fat pathways, the ketogenic pathways actually support healthy mitochondria. And another amazing side effect of ketogenic diets is, as you mentioned, weight loss, which of course cardiovascular disease and being overweight and things like that is another huge contributor to kidney disease. So it's got some amazing benefits. And I think maybe prehistorically we were more burning ketones and being far more in a ketosis sort of state. Potentially that is the pathway of preference, maybe from our ancestors and things like that, maybe. So, yeah. And you feel a lot, obviously, healthier and
it's absolutely transformed. I couldn't have done the 0-5-100 without being in ketosis. I've taken up more active sports now because I don't need to worry about my glucose control. I don't do anaerobic sports, so I'd probably finish me off. But steady, sustained physical activity over hours. You just fast for the day. And you just rely on your body just to burn fat. You never feel hungry, and you never hit the wall because it's impossible to hit the wall because you don't run out of glycogen. So physical activity becomes enjoyable, and you don't have to be all the time worrying about what your diabetes is doing, whether your insulin is going to send you into a hypo. Whether your insulin is going to send you into a hypo or something like that. So much easier overall. The risk profile, you talk about kidney disease, is in favor of normalizing blood glucose, really, lowering weight, lowering blood pressure. And the risk that manages the risk of getting kidney disease by just improving the markers that are associated with deteriorating function of the kidneys and the eyes and the heart, etc. It's a win-win as far as I'm concerned, which is why I'm so keen to ensure that people are informed about it. Should they choose to do it is entirely up to them, but they need to know that it exists, I think.
I agree. And it's one of those diets that, I think has had a lot of fear beaten up around it because of this. We went through that anti-fat movement back in the 80s and early 90s, right? So, and it's only just coming back in vogue now if people properly understand the pathways. So I really appreciate you sharing that. And we're going to catch up again and actually go right through in detail what a ketogenic diet looks like and all of those sort of things. But if people want to get in touch with you or understand that, I know you've got a website and you do training for healthcare practitioners, don't you, to actually train on that?
Yeah, I've got a couple of courses, different levels. There's a 6-hour course and a 20+ hour course, fully referenced with assessments, which is accessible through my website, which you'll put up. Type1keto.com. Yeah. Okay.
I will definitely put that up. And, if you're working with, Jesse, Anna, or I would always say, if you're working with a healthcare practitioner and you want to implement keto and they don't know anything about it, get your healthcare practitioner to do the research and actually take the course. You managed to go and self-educate, and obviously you changed your mind about what it looked like from your background to this, and you're a walking example of it being really, really effective. And I know in any of my patients with diabetes, if we've put in a ketogenic diet, we're seeing exactly the same results. So amazing. Is there anything else that you want to share or that we haven't covered that you feel is important for what we're talking about today?
I think today, I mean, the key thing is insulin as much as you need, but as little as possible is what I would recommend to most people. But that doesn't mean you can ever stop your insulin. It's just try to manage your insulin. And the best way to do that is through a ketogenic lifestyle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, I really appreciate your time and just your knowledge. And of course, it's so different when you live and breathe it. It's not here, it's embodied. So you're a walking example of what that looks like. And I think just getting the knowledge out there. Again, I'll put Dr. Lake's details below. If you're a healthcare practitioner and you want to know more about how to implement a ketogenic diet, you can go through his course. And if you're a curious human that just wants to understand more about it as well, you can dig into the 6 hours and get a really good understanding of that. If you are looking at switching from your regular diet to a ketogenic diet, we always recommend that you work with a healthcare practitioner to get it right, especially if you've got something like kidney disease, and making sure you get the right amount of oils and things like that. Some people go into ketosis quite easily, like myself. My body loves to burn ketones, and other people, we really have to tinker around with it till the body goes, oh, okay, I'll use that pathway. So sometimes you do need a little bit of help with that sort of stuff. So if you want to know more about what we do, you can always head to www.kidneycoach.com and also to Facebook, www.facebook.com/kidneycoach. We often put up things about diabetes and things in there. Remember to hit subscribe. So anytime that we'll have Dr. Lake on again, absolutely, to talk more about this and to dive more into the little facets of ketogenic diets and what they look like. So make sure you hit subscribe and you'll get notified anytime that happens. Dr. Lake, I really want to thank you again for your time and being so generous, and just for being a walking embodiment of what this looks like. That gives people a lot of hope. We hope you've enjoyed it. Thanks for being part of our community, and we will see you all next time. Bye.